Tokyo Bay, November 1943. In the underground basement of the Naval Technical Research Institute, fluorescent tubes flicker over a row of humming machines. Oscilloscopes glow pale green. The air smells of warm dust and transformer oil. A small group of naval scientists gathers around a captured American radar set, a bulky, unfamiliar box stamped with a serial plate that reads SCR 584. When they switch it on, the room fills with a sharp electronic hum. A pulse of light dances across the cathode ray tube, clean, thin, and steady. On another screen, a tiny blip appears, moving fast, tracing the path of an aircraft 20 miles away. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Coombe leans forward, stunned. The signal is crystal clear. Their own equipment, the Type 21, would have barely caught that at half the range. Someone whispers, almost afraid, "It sees in the dark." In that moment, silence replaces pride. Every man in the room understands what the Americans have built, and what Japan has not. To understand why that single trace felt like a revelation, we must go back to the long road that led here. Long before that glowing radar trace lit up in Tokyo, the war for electromagnetic vision had already begun. Quietly, invisibly, years before the first bomb fell. In the 1930s, radar was still a whispered concept, an unproven promise among physicists tinkering with oscillators and antennas. Britain called it radio direction finding. The Americans used the term pulse detection. The Japanese, meanwhile, pursued similar experiments under the title Denpa Hyote, wave measurement. Everyone knew radio could travel great distances. Few yet imagined it could see. In 1935, British scientist Robert Watson Watt's team proved that a pulsed radio beam could detect an aircraft. That same year, Japanese engineers at the Naval Technical Research Institute in Yokosuka conducted their own tests, bouncing waves off a destroyer's mast in Tokyo Bay. The experiment worked. A faint echo returned. But while Britain and the United States rushed to industrialize radar as a strategic weapon, Japan treated it as a scientific curiosity, a future possibility rather than an urgent tool. By 1939, the Royal Air Force had already built the Chain Home Network, a line of radar towers along England's coast that would soon alert Spitfires to approaching Luftwaffe raids. The Americans were experimenting with airborne radar and gunnery systems. Yet in Japan, resources were divided. The Navy favored long-range detection at sea. The Army focused on artillery spotting. Rivalries between branches slowed coordination. Each service built its own research labs, its own designs, and even its own vocabulary for radar terms. When Japan entered the war in December 1941, its fleet was formidable, the largest carrier force on Earth. But its radar program was still embryonic. Only a few experimental sets existed, none yet installed on operational ships. Japanese commanders relied instead on trained eyes, powerful binoculars, and an almost spiritual faith in night vision and intuition. Kankaku. Then came the first shocks at sea. In the dark waters around Guadalcanal and the Solomons, the U.S. Navy's new radar-equipped ships fought with an eerie advantage. On November 13, 1942, at the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, American cruisers like the USS Helena used SG radar to detect Japanese destroyers through thick night and rain, opening fire before the Japanese even knew they'd been seen. To Japanese officers, it felt supernatural. How could the enemy fire so accurately in total darkness? Reports filtered back to Tokyo. The Americans had electronic eyes. Some believed it was a rumor. Others dismissed it as luck. But as night after night American gunnery proved unnervingly precise, the scientific branches began to suspect what was really happening. Japan's first operational radar, the Type 21, entered service in 1942. It operated on meter waves, roughly 150 MHz, using long, clumsy antennas and low resolution. It could spot an aircraft formation at about 70 kilometers, but could not reliably distinguish altitude or heading. Worse, its signal faded in heavy rain or near mountains, and its operators lacked training. Meanwhile, Allied laboratories were already experimenting with microwave radar, far higher frequencies, shorter wavelengths, and finer accuracy. Britain's invention of the cavity magnetron, a compact, high-power microwave generator, had transformed radar overnight. The Americans adopted it quickly, integrating it into shipborne and airborne systems. By 1943, the gap was not just technological, it was strategic. Radar had become the invisible architecture of modern warfare. Early warning, night interception, artillery fire control, naval gunnery, submarine detection. Every pulse of energy carried information, and every echo could change a battle's outcome. Japan had brilliant physicists, men like Yoji Ito and Hidetsugu Yagi, but they worked in silos. Their theoretical knowledge was impressive, but wartime manufacturing lagged. High-quality vacuum tubes, precision machining, stable frequency components, all were scarce. As Tokyo focused its industry on ships and aircraft, the delicate infrastructure radar required was neglected. By the time Japan realized radar was not just an accessory, but the nervous system of modern warfare, the Allies had already integrated it into every level of command. From radar picket ships to night fighter control centers, from bombing navigation to anti-submarine sweeps, Allied forces could see, while Japan too often was blind. Still, within the military's technical institutes, a quiet determination grew. To catch up, to understand, to replicate. That determination would lead to one of the most revealing experiments of the entire war, the testing of captured American radar systems. But before that, the Japanese had to face an even deeper problem. The radar gap wasn't only a matter of equipment, it was a matter of systems. The more Japan's engineers studied radar, the more they realized that hardware alone was not what made the Allies so formidable. The real power lay in how those pulses of light and sound were woven into a system. By 1943, the Americans had turned radar into a doctrine. Every aircraft carrier, cruiser, and shore base was tied into a network of combat information centers, CICs. Inside these dimly lit rooms, radar operators, plotters, and officers worked in coordinated silence. Blips became vectors. Vectors became tracks. Tracks became firing solutions or interception orders, all in minutes. Radar wasn't simply seen. It was interpreted. When a U.S. destroyer's radar detected enemy aircraft 80 miles away, the signal didn't vanish into a notebook. It moved instantly through headsets and voice lines, to fighter direction officers, to gunnery officers, to fleet command. This living nervous system let the U.S. Navy fight in fog, at night, or through rain. Conditions once thought impossible. Japan had no such structure. Its ships carried radar sets as isolated tools. Operators often doubled as radio men, untrained in interpreting patterns or estimating speed and altitude. There was no central plotting room where multiple radars fed a single tactical picture. Each ship saw only what its own screen displayed, a narrow slice of a vast sky or sea. When contact reports came by voice, there was no standard format. Delays, confusion, and misjudged bearings turned potential advantage into chaos. Even at the top, the philosophy differed. American commanders saw radar as a weapon of coordination. Japanese commanders saw it as a supplement. To them, the human eye, honed by discipline and courage, remained the ultimate censor. Many senior officers distrusted what they called machine sight. They valued intuition over instrumentation, a mindset shaped by decades of naval tradition, and samurai ethos. But machines have no respect for tradition. As the war expanded, Japan began fielding its own radar models, the Type 13 for early warning, the Type 22 for shipborne surface detection, and the Type 23 for gunnery assistance. On paper, these were functional. In practice, their limitations were crippling. They operated on long wavelengths, giving poor resolution. Their transmitters drifted with temperature. Many lacked proper duplexers, forcing operators to manually switch between transmit and receive. A dangerous delay in combat. Still, production continued. By mid-1943, hundreds of radar units had been manufactured, though installation lagged. Coastal stations dotted Japan's home islands and some occupied territories. Yet these stations often worked in isolation, their signals manually relayed by telephone or courier. The vision of a unified air defense network never materialized. Then came a turning point. Not on the battlefield, but in the aftermath of one. In early 1943, during the campaign in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, Japanese forces captured several Allied radar installations intact. One was a British GL-MK2 gun-laying radar. Another, an American SCR-268 and later an SCR-270. They were sent back to Japan for study under the supervision of the Naval Technical Research Institute and the Army's Radio Research Department. For the first time, Japanese scientists could compare their equipment directly with Allied systems, and the difference was alarming. The Allied sets were compact, stable, and remarkably efficient. Their signals were sharp. Their display scopes showed precise, repeatable echoes. They used magnetrons that generated wavelengths a fraction of Japan's, in the centimeter range, not meters. These smaller wavelengths meant narrower beams, higher resolution, and the ability to track single aircraft rather than formations. Engineers like Lieutenant Commander Yoji Ito immediately understood the implications. With microwave radar, the Allies could not only see farther, they could target. They could guide fighters at night, direct gunfire through cloud, and even land bombers in fog. Ito's team began feverishly reverse engineering the captured sets. They built prototypes based on the cavity magnetron, which they nicknamed Magokoro, sincere heart. But mass production was nearly impossible. Precision copper machining, tungsten alloys, and ceramic insulators were all in short supply. Japan's industrial base, stretched thin by blockade and bombing, could not reproduce the magnetron at scale. The tests continued nonetheless. Each experiment revealed the same truth. Japan's radar was years behind, not because of ignorance, but because of structure. The Allies had built radar into the bloodstream of war, integrated with tactics, logistics, and communication. Japan had treated it like an organ without arteries. By late 1943, this realization began to haunt its scientists. They understood the equations, but not the system. And that gap, between theory and application, would soon reveal itself in combat, in the most unforgiving way possible. All these lessons converged in one defining moment, when Japanese scientists tested an American radar head-to-head against their own. It was a moment that would strip away illusion and expose the blindness beneath their pride. Technological angle. The invisible revolution at its core. Radar is the art of listening to echoes, a pulse of radio energy sent outward, reflected, and measured by time delay. The science is simple. The mastery lies in precision, and that precision was where Japan lagged behind. Early Japanese sets like the Type 21 and Type 22 operated in the meter band, long wavelengths that required antennas several meters across. These systems could detect large aircraft formations or surface ships, but their resolution was poor. The beam spread wide, making it impossible to pinpoint altitude or separate nearby targets. For a night battle, it was like staring through fog with blurred eyes. Allied radars, meanwhile, had leapt forward with the introduction of the cavity magnetron, a device that produced powerful microwave radiation, with wavelengths in centimeters rather than meters. This single innovation revolutionized detection. A smaller wavelength meant tighter beams, smaller antennas, sharper echoes. It allowed radar sets to fit inside aircraft, submarines, and even gun turrets, and to track a single target rather than a cluster. Japanese engineers understood the theory. In fact, one of their own, Professor Hidetsugu Yagi, had pioneered the directional Yagi-Uda antenna used worldwide. But translating laboratory brilliance into mass-produced precision hardware under wartime blockade was nearly impossible. Japan lacked the high-purity copper, heat-resistant ceramics, and crystal rectifiers needed for reliable magnetrons. When Japanese scientists tested a captured U.S. SCR-584 radar, the contrast was undeniable. The American scope was steady, clear and sharp, even when the room vibrated from nearby generators. Their own Type 22's trace wobbled and smeared. The difference was not just in craftsmanship, it was in design philosophy. Allied engineers had optimized radar for rugged field use. Japan had built laboratory instruments pressed into combat. In the end, radar became a mirror of industrial capacity. Every pulse of light across the American scope reflected an entire economy's rhythm. Research, production, logistics, and training all synchronized into one signal. Tactical angle. Seeing before the enemy, saw at sea and in the air, radar was not a gadget, it was time itself. Every mile of early detection meant an extra minute to react, and in modern warfare, minutes decided life or death. When U.S. Navy destroyers sailed into night engagements in the Solomon Islands, their radar operators tracked Japanese ships long before visual contact. They plotted bearings, relayed coordinates to gun directors, and opened fire with shocking accuracy. Shells found targets before Japanese lookouts could even spot muzzle flashes. For Japan's Navy, trained in the proud art of night fighting, it was an existential shock. The Imperial Navy had once been masters of darkness, their lookouts legendary for spotting silhouettes against the faintest horizon glow. But radar erased that human advantage overnight. In the air, the same story unfolded. American night fighters, especially the radar-equipped P-61 Black Widow, could stalk bombers undetected, guided by ground controllers using microwave radar. Japan's home defense relied mostly on sound locators, searchlights, and sparse early warning sets. Many incoming B-29 raids were not detected until the bomb bays opened overhead. Even when radar stations worked, their information rarely reached interceptors in time. There was no nationwide control network, no integrated plotting. By contrast, the British and Americans had spent years refining such systems, first over London, then over the Pacific. The result was a seamless chain: detection, communication, interception, kill. In this new warfare, the first to see was the first to strike. Japan's commanders, used to counting ships, now had to count seconds. Human angle, pride, shock, and understanding inside the Naval Technical Research Institute. Scientists like Lieutenant Commander Yoji Ito and Lieutenant Kume carried a quiet burden. They were patriots, scholars, and engineers, men who had devoted their youth to building Japan's scientific self-reliance. Yet as the war deepened, they found themselves staring at glowing screens that reflected not triumph, but loss. Many of them had studied abroad before the war, fluent in Western journals and radio theory. They knew that in 1940, Japan's science was not far behind. But war had changed everything. Allied nations pooled resources across universities, corporations, and the military. Japan's researchers worked in isolation, with little cross-service exchange. Ito once remarked in his notes that Japanese radar could see, but not well enough to command. That single line captured the tragedy of Japan's technical elite. Brilliant minds constrained by bureaucracy and limited means. When they first powered up the captured American radar, some felt awe, others anger. One technician later recalled feeling betrayed by physics, as if the universe itself had favored the enemy. But most felt something deeper: respect. The American engineers had not just copied formulas, they had perfected the system around the machine. As months passed, the Institute's mood shifted from pride to realism. Engineers documented their findings meticulously, hoping their reports might one day rebuild Japan's science after the war. Even in defeat, there was dignity in truth, and that truth, that the Allies had built an invisible empire of waves and echoes, was now undeniable. The next layer of understanding would come from beyond the lab, in strategy rooms and command towers, where leaders grappled with the organizational collapse radar revealed. 4. Leadership and organizational angle. A system, without a center leadership, decides whether invention becomes victory. In the case of Japan's radar program, leadership became its heaviest chain. Within Japan's wartime structure, The Navy and Army guarded their technological domains like rival kingdoms. Each developed radar independently, refusing to share research or components. The Navy focused on shipborne detection, the Army on air warning. Even within branches, manufacturers like NEC, Toshiba, and Hitachi competed for contracts instead of cooperating. What Britain and America achieved through unity, Japan buried under hierarchy. The Allies had created centralized institutions. The British Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, the U.S. Radiation Laboratory at MIT, where physicists, mathematicians, and military officers worked side by side. Ideas moved fast. Mistakes became lessons for everyone. In Japan, research reports moved through layers of command bureaucracy, often delayed by months. Field units requesting equipment had to write formal letters up the chain, then wait for factory approval. Urgency met inertia. By the time a radar was installed, the battlefield had already moved. Training was equally fragmented. Radar operators were often former radio technicians, with minimal understanding of electromagnetic theory. Manuals were scarce, calibration procedures inconsistent. A malfunctioning radar might go unreported for days, or be blamed on bad weather. Commanders distrusted the readings, preferring binoculars and intuition. This systemic weakness created what post-war analysts later called the invisible gap. Japan did not lack brains or courage, it lacked organization. Its radar program was a microcosm of its wartime command culture. Brilliant individuals constrained by a rigid structure. When American and British planners spoke of the radar war, they meant an interconnected enterprise. When Japanese officers spoke of radar, they meant a device. That difference defined the war's outcome long before a single bomb fell on Tokyo. Enemy countermeasures angle. The Echo War radar didn't just revolutionize detection, it sparked a duel of deception. Every beam sent into the sky could be bent, jammed, or blinded. By 1944, this electronic shadow war was in full swing. The Allies, confident in their technological lead, began using window, thin strips of aluminum foil dropped from bombers to create false echoes on Japanese radar screens. Whole bomber formations could vanish behind shimmering clouds of phantom signals. Japanese operators, unused to such countermeasures, often mistook the decoys for massive raids or ghost fleets. Japan tried to respond. Engineers experimented with filters to reduce clutter, and some Navy technicians developed primitive passive receivers to locate enemy radar emissions. But without microwave capability, their jamming power was weak. Worse, they lacked the test equipment to measure effectiveness. At sea, Japanese ships attempted radio silence and visual signaling to avoid Allied radar interception. But it was futile. American SG and SP radar could detect even small metal hulls at miles of range. In the air, Japanese night fighters equipped with long-wave sets could see bombers only at short range, while Allied radar-guided interceptors hunted them with pinpoint accuracy. Radar had turned the battlefield into a chessboard of invisible moves. The Allies, armed with stronger electronics and faster intelligence cycles, played several moves ahead. Japan played by instinct, often reacting to ghosts. Psychological angle. Pride shattered by clarity technology's most devastating impact isn't always on the battlefield. Sometimes it strikes the human spirit. For Japan's military elite, radar was not just an instrument. It was a revelation of vulnerability. For decades, the Imperial Navy had prided itself on intuition, courage, and discipline, the will of the warrior guiding the fleet. Battleships and pilots were extensions of honor, not systems. When radar exposed how decisively the Allies could predict, coordinate, and strike, it challenged the very foundation of that belief. A senior officer once said during a debrief in 1944, "We have not been outfought. We have been outseen." The psychological shock ran deep. Within the research institutes, engineers faced a painful paradox. They were among Japan's most intelligent men, yet every success revealed a deeper failure. Each time a captured Allied radar performed flawlessly, it reminded them how blind their own fleets had been. Some turned their frustration inward, blaming the Navy's secrecy or the Army's arrogance. Others found quiet admiration for the enemy's discipline and integration. In a report after the war, one engineer wrote, "It was not the machine that defeated us. It was the cooperation behind it." This confession became symbolic of Japan's wartime science, brilliance suffocated by fragmentation. By the time these realizations reached high command, it was too late. Allied fleets now swept the Pacific under an invisible shield, guided by radar eyes that saw through cloud, darkness, and deception. All these lessons, all these contrasts, technology, leadership, and morale, converged toward one climactic demonstration, when the truth of Japan's blindness would no longer be theoretical, but absolute. Tokyo Naval Research Center. Winter 1943. The room is silent except for the rhythmic hum of cooling fans. A large American radar set, the SCR-584, sits beside Japan's newest prototype, the Type 22 Model 4. Both point toward the same stretch of sky. It's a rare, clear morning. Far above Tokyo Bay, a reconnaissance aircraft circles, waiting to serve as the test subject. The purpose is simple: a direct comparison. How far can each radar see? How sharply can each define the same target? When the test begins, both scopes flicker with green light. On the Japanese screen, the trace appears. Faint, irregular, swimming in noise. The operators adjust dials, switch amplifiers, refocus. The signal steadies, but it's fuzzy. The altitude estimate wavers between 12 and 15,000 feet. Then they look to the American set. Its scope shows a single sharp blip, clean as ink on paper. The range marker locks instantly, 15,800 feet, bearing 61 degrees. As the aircraft turns, the blip moves in a perfect arc. The SCR-584 tracks automatically, antenna swiveling with mechanical grace. In that moment, the room understands everything. This was not merely a better radar. It was a different era of science. The American set could track an aircraft smaller than a destroyer's mast in real time through interference. Its operator didn't even touch the controls. Japan's machine still relied on skill. America's relied on design. Lieutenant Commander Yoji Ito quietly orders the test repeated. Once more, the results are identical. The difference is beyond question. The Japanese scientists exchange looks, not of surprise, but of dawning comprehension. For years they had believed radar's value lay in range. Now they saw it lay in fidelity, in the purity of signal, the stability of electronics, the precision of every component. Ito asks his assistants to open the American device's housing. Inside they find beautifully machined copper waveguides, magnetron cavities polished to mirror finish, and neat wiring looms that speak of mass production, not handmade assembly. The craftsmanship is industrial art. When the tests conclude, the scientists record their findings. American radar performance exceeds domestic design by factor of approximately 10. Tracking accuracy unmatched. Component precision beyond replication at current capacity. But the real shock comes days later, when the implications are traced to the battlefield. Reports from the Pacific paint a picture now made painfully clear by the experiment. U.S. carrier groups, each ship equipped with radar, had begun fighting with invisible coordination. Fighter direction officers could vector Hellcats toward enemy raids hundreds of kilometers away. Destroyers could pick up incoming torpedoes in darkness and maneuver to avoid them. Battleships like Iowa and Washington fired radar-directed salvos that hit targets at ranges once thought impossible. In contrast, Japanese convoys were ambushed again and again. Submarines used radar to locate them at night. Radar-equipped B-24 Liberators stalked transports in the South China Sea. By the time lookouts spotted the attackers, it was already too late. In one chilling report, a convoy commander wrote, "We did not see the enemy. We only saw the shells." The test at Tokyo confirmed what the battlefield had already proven. Japan's radar, though functional, could never close the gap. The Allies had built not only superior technology, but an entire infrastructure of perception. Every sensor, operator, and commander was part of one vast machine that could see across oceans. For the scientists at the Institute, it was both revelation and reckoning. They had devoted their lives to mastering the unseen, only to discover that they were years behind. And time was the one resource Japan no longer had. In the months that followed, frantic efforts began to reproduce the magnetron. The Mago Koro project attempted to miniaturize components, to create a homegrown microwave radar. A few experimental sets reached field trials by mid-1944. None approached Allied reliability. By then, B-29 bombers were already raiding Japan's home islands, guided by the very same radar technology now sitting on those laboratory benches. A cruel symmetry. The scientists could only watch the skies they had once hoped to command. Still, even in defeat, the comparison test at Tokyo became a turning point. Not for victory, but for understanding. It was the moment Japan's brightest minds accepted the scale of their disadvantage and the limits of pride against precision. And yet the story of radar's revelation was not finished. For what followed was not just a lab experiment, but the final, brutal confirmation of this blindness, in combat itself, when Japan's defenses faced the full power of Allied radar-guided war. By the spring of 1944, the Pacific Ocean had become an invisible battlefield, one mapped not by ships and planes, but by waves and echoes. What began in the laboratories of Tokyo now played out across thousands of miles, where the difference between seeing and not seeing meant survival itself. Radar Ascendant, the Allied eyes of the Pacific. The U.S. Navy's fleet had turned radar from a mere device into an entire sensory organism. Each carrier task force operated like a living network. Destroyers formed the outer ring of detection, cruisers the mid-layer of coordination, and carriers the brain, directing interceptors long before the enemy appeared on the horizon. At the heart of this evolution stood the Combat Information Center, CIC. Deep within steel hulls, young officers sat beneath glowing screens, mapping enemy movements in real time. When Japanese bombers took off from distant islands, their signatures appeared as faint dots, tracked across hundreds of miles. Fighters were launched with clockwork precision. By the time enemy aircraft reached the fleet, American pilots were already diving from the clouds above them. This was most evident during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944. For the Japanese, it was meant to be the decisive strike to halt America's advance. Hundreds of carrier-based aircraft roared into the sky in the largest naval air battle in history. But as soon as they left their decks, they were already being watched. Allied radar picked up their formations 150 miles out. Controllers aboard USS Lexington and Enterprise tracked every wave, feeding bearings to fighter directors who scrambled interceptors like an automated reflex. The result was slaughter. In less than a single afternoon, over 350 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, most before they ever saw an American ship. Pilots who survived later described it as flying into a wall of unseen fire. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. This was the moment when radar changed from a secret weapon to a civilization-defining force. It gave the U.S. Navy omnipresence, a calm, mechanical omniscience that Japan's warriors could neither match nor comprehend. Japan's blind defense back home, as Tokyo's air defenses scrambled to respond to the first B-29 superfortress raids, radar's absence turned the sky into chaos. The Type 13 early warning radar, Japan's most widespread model, could detect a formation at 100 kilometers, but only if the weather was clear and the signal operator was skilled. Often, the machines broke down or produced ghost echoes. Without a national radar reporting grid, warnings arrived too late. On November 24, 1944, when 111 B-29s bombed Tokyo for the first time, the alarm came barely 5 minutes before impact. Japanese fighters took off blind, their radar uncalibrated, their communication channels overlapping. American bombers, guided by the AN/APQ-13 radar system, navigated through cloud cover with unerring accuracy. In the command bunkers below, officers could only guess where the enemy was. The irony was unbearable. Japanese scientists had spent years studying radar's promise, yet their nation was now being destroyed by it. The carrier night battles. Radar in the dark at sea. Radar's dominance reached its purest expression in the Battle of Surigao Strait, October 1944, part of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf. Here, U.S. battleships used radar-directed gunnery to annihilate a Japanese surface force before the enemy even saw them. The American destroyers detected Japanese ships approaching the strait long before visual contact, plotted their positions, and launched torpedoes guided entirely by radar bearings. When the battleships West Virginia and Tennessee opened fire, their main batteries were guided by SG radar, striking targets with precision in complete darkness. Japanese ships never got within visual range. Some commanders never realized what hit them until their vessels were aflame. One Japanese survivor described the scene afterward. "We fought shadows. The sea glowed with gunfire we could not see. Every flash came from the dark. Every shell found its mark." It was the end of Japan's mastery of night battle, an art form it had once perfected. Radar had erased centuries of naval tradition in a single night. The invisible divide, by 1945, the difference between American and Japanese radar technology could be measured not just in meters or megahertz, but in fate itself. Every Allied fleet now sailed under a protective dome of information, while Japan fought in an information vacuum. When American submarines hunted convoys, they did so guided by radar periscopes and surface search sets. Japanese merchant ships had none. When B-29s struck factories, their bombing paths were radar-plotted. Japan's interceptors were still guided by guesswork. The great irony was that Japan possessed the intellectual foundation to have matched the Allies, but not the time or system to execute it. Each test, each failure, and each burned-out tube told the same story. The war had outpaced the laboratory. Even as Japan's cities burned, the radar scientists continued their work, not out of delusion, but duty. In secret basements beneath universities and naval yards, they documented every experiment, recording data that would later form the foundation of Japan's post-war electronics industry. By the war's final months, the American radar network had become so comprehensive that even Japan's surrender broadcast on August 15, 1945, was picked up and confirmed through signal tracking, another echo in the invisible spectrum that had defined the entire conflict. Radar had begun as an experiment in invisible waves. It ended as a revolution in perception, one that decided the outcome of the greatest war in history before most people even understood it was happening. For Japan's scientists, the test of 1943 was no longer a laboratory exercise. It had become prophecy fulfilled. The radar that once revealed a single blip over Tokyo Bay had by 1945 drawn the map of their nation's defeat. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the echoes of radar's invisible war still hummed through the ruins. In every burned-out laboratory, in every dismantled naval yard, stood machines that had promised sight and delivered revelation. At the Naval Technical Research Institute, scientists returned to their destroyed laboratories. Many of them, men like Lieutenant Commander Yoji Ito and Professor Hidetsugu Yagi, walked among shattered oscilloscopes and melted copper coils, taking notes amid the debris. They weren't searching for weapons anymore. They were preserving memory. Their notes tell a quiet story, not of bitterness, but of comprehension. Radar had not simply been a new instrument. It had represented a new philosophy of war. The Allies had learned to treat information as a weapon, precision as strategy, and cooperation as force. Japan had fought with courage and discipline, but without unity of vision. Post-war technical assessments, compiled under U.S. supervision, confirmed what Ito's 1943 experiment had revealed. The American SCR-584, the British H-2S, and the naval SG series had achieved performance levels far beyond Japan's final wartime models. The reports measured failure in decibels and microseconds, cold numbers that, collectively, described a nation's strategic blindness. In total, Japan had produced approximately 2,000 radar units by 1945, many of them unreliable, few networked. By contrast, the United States manufactured over 150,000 radar sets of more than 100 different types. Every destroyer, bomber, and even landing craft carried one. The disparity wasn't just quantitative. It reflected the gulf between two civilizations of industry. When Allied occupation forces inspected Japan's radar facilities, they were struck not by ignorance, but by effort. Engineers had documented every test, every calibration, and every failed magnetron attempt. Their theoretical work was solid, even elegant, but their factories could not match the precision machining and quality control radar demanded. The Allies concluded that Japan's radar scientists had a complete understanding of the principles, but an incomplete command of the production art. Still, from defeat came seeds of rebirth. In the late 1940s, many of the same engineers who had once built wartime radar turned their knowledge toward peacetime technology. Their mastery of high-frequency circuits and vacuum tube design became the backbone of Japan's post-war electronics revolution. Companies like NEC, Toshiba, and Hitachi, which had once manufactured military radar, shifted toward communications, broadcasting, and measurement instruments. Yoji. Ito himself later helped develop Japan's first television transmitters. Hidetsugu Yagi's antenna designs became global standards. The magnetron, once the symbol of defeat, became the beating heart of the microwave oven, a domestic appliance that would later symbolize Japan's economic comeback. Yet, amid these transformations, the memory of that wartime blindness lingered. Japanese officers who had commanded radar-equipped ships during the war often recalled how they distrusted their own instruments. One post-war interviewee said, "We believed in the man, not the machine. That was our mistake." Others reflected more painfully. "We thought we could fight spirit with spirit, but the enemy fought with systems." For Japan's scientific community, these confessions carried weight. They had spent the war proving what was possible, only to realize that technology alone could not overcome institutional isolation. Radar became a metaphor. A symbol of how a nation that could see the echo still failed to understand what it meant. In the ashes of 1945, Japan's scientists finally saw clearly, not through the phosphor of an oscilloscope, but through the lens of history. The experiment that began with 2 radar sets side by side in Tokyo had revealed not just a technical gap, but a philosophical one. The difference between knowing and believing, between invention and integration. That realization would shape Japan's post-war identity. A transformation from militarized ambition to technological precision. But the reckoning wasn't over. Beyond the laboratories and the engineers lay the military legacy. Commanders, pilots, and sailors who now had to face the war's outcome and its moral cost. The surrender broadcast on August 15, 1945, was supposed to mark an end. For Japan's scientists and officers, it marked the beginning of reflection, the kind that burns deeper than defeat itself. In interrogation rooms and Allied technical interviews, former naval officers often struggled to explain how a nation of such intellect could lose so absolutely in the field of science. Their answers revealed more about culture than engineering. "We trusted the spirit," one captain said, "when the enemy trusted the system." That statement echoed across dozens of reports. Japan had mastered the courage to fight, but not the humility to coordinate. For centuries, the Japanese military had been built around the ideal of the decisive individual, the pilot, the swordsman, the commander. But radar was not a weapon for heroes. It was a weapon for networks. It rewarded organization, not instinct. This realization was painful for men who had built their lives on the virtue of intuition. When U.S. officers demonstrated radar plotting to Japanese observers after the war, showing how multiple ships and aircraft shared one synchronized map, one witness later wrote, "It was like seeing what God must see. Everything, everywhere, all at once." That metaphor captured what radar truly symbolized: the transformation of war from human perception to mechanical omniscience. For Japan, this was more than a tactical failure. It was a moral one, a confrontation between two worldviews, the individual's will versus the collective system's intelligence. As Japan rebuilt, that moral wound became a blueprint. The post-war generation of scientists, many trained in those same wartime institutes, vowed never again to let national pride outweigh technical truth. They redefined science not as obedience to authority, but as collaboration through precision. The new Japan that emerged in the 1950s, the Japan of engineers, manufacturers, and innovators, was born from the radar lessons of 1943. The Allied occupation's Science and Technology Reorganization Committee encouraged this transformation. Instead of punishing Japan's scientists, it preserved them, redirecting their genius into civilian industries. American officers like Dr. Charles Allen, who evaluated Japan's electronics sector, noted with astonishment how quickly former radar researchers adapted to telecommunications, broadcasting, and measurement systems. Within a decade, Japan was exporting radio transmitters that matched American quality. Radar had taught them the language of precision, timing, and integration, lessons that would later power Japan's rise in consumer electronics, semiconductors, and computing. Yet among the old generation of wartime scientists, there remained a quiet melancholy. Yoji Ito, reflecting in a 1956 interview, said, "We learned too late that technology has no patriotism. The waves obey only the laws of physics." In that single line lay both regret and wisdom. Radar had exposed the limits of nationalism in an age of global science. Some historians later called radar the weapon that ended the age of heroes. It did not roar like a cannon or flash like a bomb, but it erased uncertainty, and in doing so, redefined power itself. For Japan, radar's defeat became its teacher. The scientists who once watched the clear, unwavering trace of the American scope in 1943 carried that memory for life. It was more than the image of an aircraft. It was the moment they realized clarity itself could be weaponized. And from that clarity, Japan rebuilt its vision. Not through conquest, but through comprehension. The war had blinded them. Science, finally, taught them to see. In the quiet after war, when the radar stations went silent and the echoes faded into peacetime static, the true lesson of Japan's blindness became clear. It was never only about electronics or engineering. It was about perception itself. The story of radar in the Second World War is not the story of machines that saw through darkness. It is the story of how human beings learned to trust what they could not see. For centuries, warfare had been ruled by the senses: eyes, ears, instinct. Radar replaced instinct with information, and in doing so reshaped the nature of decision. It turned uncertainty into geometry, intuition into mathematics, and courage into coordination. Japan's scientists were not defeated by ignorance. They were defeated by isolation. Their brilliance lived inside laboratories, but never reached the bridges of ships or the minds of commanders. The Allies, by contrast, built their strength not from genius alone, but from connection. The seamless dialogue between scientist, engineer, sailor, and pilot. That was the real victory of radar. Not the pulse of a magnetron, but the pulse of cooperation. When Yoji Ito watched that clean American radar trace in 1943, he was not merely seeing an aircraft in the sky. He was witnessing the future, a world where power would no longer come from the sharpest sword or the bravest soldier, but from the clearest signal and the fastest system to act on it. Today, radar remains everywhere, guiding ships, guarding airspace, measuring storms. Yet behind each echo still lies that moment in Tokyo Bay, when a handful of men stared at a glowing green screen and realized that science had changed the meaning of sight forever. The war ended, but the signal never stopped. It traveled forward through decades of peace, reminding humanity that the greatest victories are not won by seeing farther, but by learning, finally, how to see together. If this story gave you a clearer view into the hidden side of World War II, The war fought in waves, wires, and echoes. Don't let it fade. Subscribe for more forgotten chapters of military technology and the people behind them. Like this video if you believe history deserves to be seen as clearly as radar once saw through the storm. Comment below. Which wartime innovation do you think changed humanity the most? Share this documentary to help others understand how science quietly shaped victory long before the battles were seen. You've been watching Japanese scientists tested American radar, then realized they'd been blind all along.